Hello and good morning. I'm here to introduce my colleague Patrick Watson, who's going to be taking us through some of our focus and research on Microsoft. So over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Dom. Good morning / afternoon, everyone, wherever you're based at the moment. Thanks for joining me for this session. As Dom said, I will be exploring the opportunities and potential threats associated with Microsoft's communication portfolio. For those who don't know me, as Dom said, my name is Patrick Watson, a senior research analyst here at Cavell. I've been in the technology industry for about 10 years. I was a consultant in a Microsoft Gold Partner organization based in the UK for several years, and then following that was a technology journalist before joining Cavell. So I started with Cavell at the start of 2020 and to focus mainly on collaboration, and a lot of that focus on collaboration has been taken up by Microsoft. So Microsoft is one of the areas where we get the most interest from service providers who are trying to understand more about Microsoft's proposition to the industry. So in this session, I wanted to use some of our research to look at that in a bit more detail. Firstly, I think it's important to try and explain why Microsoft is so important and why it's become such a big focus for the cloud communications industry. So I think you have to acknowledge, first of all, Microsoft's pure size and market presence. It's one of the world's biggest companies in general, and also has one of the world's most recognizable technology brands, if not the most recognizable technology brand. In the Benelux region specifically, Microsoft has a pretty huge presence. It's responsible for over $2 billion in revenue in that particular area, employs over 2,000 people across the different countries in Benelux. There's over 300 Microsoft partners. And when I was doing the research for this presentation, I looked at some of the products that are available around Microsoft Teams or other Microsoft products, and I was amazed by the amount of solutions available in Benelux. So it really is one of the most advanced markets that we're looking at in terms of development of Microsoft solutions. And that might tie into what Don was talking about in the keynotes this morning in terms of adoption of cloud technologies. So outside of its size and scale and reputation, another key reason that Microsoft is such a focus for the industry is an apparent threat perception. The research you can see on screen comes from a number of different research reports and studies that we've commissioned at Cavell. The first one was back in 2019, which was completed in conjunction with the Cloud Communications Alliance. And we asked a selection of service providers what they thought the biggest threat was to the sort of status quo in the cloud communications market, and whether they thought that threat would increase or decrease. And the top response that came back was that Microsoft was the biggest perceived threat. We asked the same question in subsequent studies at the start of 2020 and then in the middle of 2020. And actually, every time we've asked the question, that threat perception has increased. So from the service provider perspective, Microsoft is seen, whether correctly or incorrectly, as the biggest growing threat to the current market status. I think another area that makes Microsoft so important is its position and its direct access to an end user's desktop through its Microsoft Office products, whether that's Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Office in the box products. So the stats you can see on screen are our global stats, and I'll look specifically at the Benelux market data throughout this presentation, but I think this is important from a global perspective. So Microsoft, depending on what data you use, appears to control market share when it comes to desktop productivity applications. And this direct access to an end user's desktop gives it a real advantage for a couple of reasons. Firstly, most users are familiar with that Microsoft user interface. They're familiar with that Microsoft user experience. And that gives Microsoft a real advantage when it comes to promoting other applications such as Microsoft Teams. And that's probably a large reason behind the pretty extraordinary growth we've seen in Microsoft Teams. So now I wanted to look specifically at Microsoft's development in the communication markets globally. So when Microsoft was founded back in the 70s, long before I was born, there was no real focus on communication. that area of focus has been developed through acquisitions of third-party organizations who specialize in what Microsoft sees as different key areas. So you can go back earlier than this, but I think it's important to start with the acquisition of Skype from 2011 for $8.5 billion, which at the time, even still now, is a lot of money. And that obviously led to the development of Skype for Business. But there have been some other key purchases. So, for example, intellectual property from Torco Inc., you can see on screen, was used in the development of the Microsoft Teams mobile application. And more recently this year, we've seen a series of acquisitions of Affirmed Networks and then Metaswitch. And these have really amplified Microsoft's networking and communications capability and expertise. Also, I've said this the last couple of days, I don't expect this to stop. Microsoft have a history of bolstering their portfolio with acquisitions. So if they feel there's an area going forward that could do with some additional attention, I don't think it's unlikely that they continue to purchase other businesses that specialize in areas that they want to improve. I think when a lot of people come to us to talk about Microsoft and talk about Microsoft in general when it comes to communications, they instantly think of Microsoft Teams. So Teams is obviously a big part of the Microsoft communication story, but it is by no means the whole picture. I think what you have to consider is Teams, Skype, and now Azure are the key assets that form what I've illustrated, the Microsoft communications umbrella. And so, as Don mentioned in his keynote this morning, Teams has seen extraordinary growth, so up to over 115 million daily active users. But we really shouldn't forget about Skype, because there's still an installed base of millions of users using the Skype for Business server editions. And there's still a really substantial base, although we don't know the exact numbers, of Skype for Business online customers. And those customers who are currently using Skype for Business Online will have to migrate over to Microsoft Teams, because the online edition of Skype for Business is end of life in summer of 2021. So we really shouldn't neglect Skype and that install base as a big part of Microsoft's communication story. However, I think, and partly because of some of the news we've had this year, the key piece of the puzzle now is Microsoft Azure. And that is for a number of reasons, but chiefly what we're seeing is a heightened focus on the Azure communications capability from Microsoft. So they launched a couple of new initiatives this year, the launch of Azure for Operators and also Azure Communication Services. And I think the launch of both of those two initiatives effectively have reaffirmed that Microsoft is really serious about their communication capabilities in Azure. So this slide and this data comes from our enterprise research study and shows how popular cloud infrastructure platforms are as more and more businesses look to leverage public and hybrid cloud deployments for all of their technology needs. And Don was talking about this morning. Less and less do on-premises systems seem suitable for a new remote working world. So we're seeing vast amounts of businesses look to the cloud for their deployments. These deployments in Azure are a real revenue opportunity for Microsoft. And that's why they're increasing this focus on Azure. They really want to attract service providers, telcos, and operators like a lot of yourselves on this call to leverage Azure for different services and systems. Obviously, Microsoft has got big competition in this area, most of which are on the slide. People like Google, GCP, Amazon AWS is very popular in communications, IBM as well. So it's an area where we're seeing a real battle between these cloud giants in terms of developing the technologies to attract providers to utilize their infrastructure platforms rather than their competitors. As I was talking about, I think this particular launch was possibly went slightly under the radar, but is potentially very significant strategically for Microsoft going forward. And that's the launch of Azure for Operators. And I've said this previously, so both my colleagues, Matt and Finbar, who were speaking previously about networking, published a full webinar on this topic. So there's a lot of detail in that. And if you want to see the full webinar and the details, you can access that free of charge from the Cavell website. But effectively, Azure for Operators offers a bespoke set of cloud services targeted at cloud comm service providers, telcos, and operators. as I was saying, Microsoft want you to move services, systems into the cloud and into Azure specifically. So this is another area where we're going to see more announcements and more development over the next couple of years as the Azure for Operators proposition develops. So that was Azure. Let's have a look at Microsoft Teams. Teams is particularly relevant for the cloud communications industry because of its popularity. As we said, the user numbers have grown dramatically, which was definitely assisted by the pandemic. But also it's relevant for our industry because of the potential integration of telephony services. So as most of you will know, you don't get telephony as standard in Microsoft Teams application. It's an additional extra. And you've got a couple of options and ways to add telephony or voice into Teams. You can use Microsoft calling plans or a process called direct routing. So calling plans use Microsoft as the end-to-end carrier to provide PSTN connectivity and numbers and minute bundles. The other option, which our research shows is by far the most popular route, is direct routing using third-party organizations. So at Cavell, we've conducted a lot of research into this area, and we've got quite detailed numbers. So if anyone on the call, on the meeting today, is interested in more details on the sort of breakdown as we see it from calling plans versus direct routing in particular countries or regions, please do get in touch for that. Just a couple of interesting stats on Teams that I wanted to raise as well. This data comes from a survey we commissioned at the start of the pandemic. So over 60 service providers took part because we wanted to find out how the pandemic had impacted the market and their provision of services. So in this particular question, we asked service providers what products end customers had been asking for. And you can see that 60% of service providers have been asked for Microsoft Teams specifically by name. So that just really goes to show how popular Teams was during the pandemic. And I think that ties into what I was talking about previously. A lot of organizations are already utilizing Microsoft Office, maybe Microsoft 365, and adding Teams seemed like a logical, easy step for them to make to add some additional communication functionality. Dom had some of this data in his presentation too, but I've tweaked it slightly for the focus on Teams. This is from our Enterprise Insight report and asked customers about the technology solutions that they were aware of. And as you can see, after Zoom, Microsoft Teams was the big winner here, with awareness already at a pretty high starting point, but it's still increased by nearly 20%. It increased by 18% because of the pandemic. So let's have a look at the Benelux countries specifically, and I've got the breakdown for each, for the Netherlands and Belgium as well, if anyone's interested in that specific detail, but I've lumped it in for the benefits of this talk. And as usual, I've highlighted it on the map as well, just in case anyone didn't know. So we used a combination of different sources to approximate these numbers, as Microsoft don't reveal a sort of country by country breakdown. So we used our research, interviews with service providers, telcos and operators, discussions with Microsoft, and also discussions with Microsoft partners like the session border controller vendors to understand a bit more detail around the numbers. So we think there are about 3 million Teams users across the Benelux countries. And you have to remember that is basic Teams application collaboration only users. As I said, telephony is an extra, so those are just basic Teams users. And we expect that number to rise significantly into 2021. The growth rate for Teams doesn't seem to be slowing dramatically, so you can expect that to exceed 4 million in the early part of next year. And in terms of telephony, our data shows that there are around 200,000 Microsoft Teams users across the Benelux region who've added telephony or voice capability into Microsoft Teams. And we expect that to grow pretty rapidly. The vast majority of those telephony or voice users will be using direct routing. As I said, it's by far the most popular avenue chosen. And we think it'll be around 160,000. 3/4 of those will be using direct routing, with the remainder using Microsoft calling plans to add voice. One of the questions that we get all the time is where are the opportunities for service providers when it comes to Teams? There aren't just opportunities, there are threats as well. And I think most of you are aware that the partner model in terms of working with Microsoft is very different to the traditional communications vendor partner model that many might be used to. But I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. So the first area that Cavell that we think provides an opportunity is through direct routing. So as I was saying, direct routing by far the most popular option over and above calling plans. And the provision of third-party telephony products is a big growth area and development area. So at Cavell, we've looked at markets all over the globe to see what types of products vendors and service providers are offering. And we've broken it down into a few categories, which are on the screen here. First is sort of a basic access solution. So many providers now offer basic access for Teams by providing SIP trunks. And the basic SIP trunk provision would allow an enterprise to connect their own or a third-party managed SBC device to the PSTN to provide direct routing connectivity into Microsoft Teams. The middle tier of products we see is this sort of direct routing as a service. So this option is designed to allow an organization to enable telephony services, but they don't have the need to either manage on-premise infrastructure in terms of an SBC or possess the in-house technical capabilities to configure and manage it. So generally, a direct routing as a service offering will include the SIP connectivity, a managed SBC, whether that's in public or private cloud, and resources covering carrier services such as phone numbers and minutes. The final option, where we've seen a lot of launches recently and a sort of flurry of activity, is the enhanced Microsoft Teams telephony service. So this will offer all the features of a direct routing as a service option, but with the addition of enhanced advanced PBX functionality. And the reason for that is vendors want an enterprise to be able to overcome any of the potential shortcomings in the basic Microsoft phone system that comes with Microsoft Teams. So these enhanced Teams telephony services often include improved integration capabilities, maybe enhanced support provision, because at the moment Microsoft only offers 99.9 SLA on Teams, and often they offer some advanced analytics and reporting features. So I've just highlighted some providers that we've been looking at across Benelux who are already offering Teams telephony solutions, and they're quite widely available now. And as I said, as I was looking at this market to put this presentation together, I was surprised by how many providers are already offering Teams telephony solutions. So providers like our sponsors today in Reach, but also Destiny, Proximus. There's a really wide range across the Netherlands and Belgium who are already offering these telephony team supporting products. And we don't expect the market to slow down. Although it appears Teams has been around for a while, it's actually a relatively young product, and we expect the market to grow significantly over the next few years as more and more organizations look to add telephony capability into their Microsoft Teams tenancies. Another key area of opportunity is contact center. So Microsoft Teams really doesn't have much customer engagement capability, although it has added some new API functionality recently. But this is a big area where providers can look to add value. As you can see on screen, a number of providers have already looked to either partner with Microsoft, because Microsoft has a Teams contact center certification program, or providers can utilize the publicly available Teams APIs to develop their own contact center integrations for Teams. So I was talking before and explained that the Microsoft partner model is very different to the traditional cloud comms vendor partner model that many service providers, telcos, and operators will be used to. First of all, the license margins available from Microsoft are likely to be significantly reduced compared to a traditional model, up to the sort of maximum margin you might expect to make on a Microsoft license is 15%. But from my own experience, reselling Microsoft licenses, I think you'd be very lucky to see anything like 15% of margin on a Microsoft license. Microsoft partners really have to look for supplementary and supporting areas to generate revenue and margin. And I've highlighted some of those potential areas around Microsoft Teams where there might be opportunities for providers, but generally you're going to have to look at other areas outside of reselling licenses. So just to conclude really quickly, a few things for service providers to consider when you're thinking about Microsoft strategy. So Teams is going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to take market share, and you need a defined strategy. Are you going to develop a supporting telephony product, a direct routing product, or a contact center integration? Or if you're not going to do that, maybe take up a competitive offering that includes a collaboration and telephony offering that can compete with Microsoft Teams. We shouldn't forget Skype. There's still a big base of Skype for Business customers who will be looking to migrate away from the platform as the development slows. So service providers might be able to leverage an opportunity by calculating their own migration pathways. Microsoft is, as I've said, I think Azure is a key piece of the puzzle and is very keen to promote Azure services to the service provider and telco community. But you're going to have to really think about the potential benefits and the potential risks involved if you do outsource some of the network functionality or cloudify that in Azure. I think the demand for specialists is growing. Specialists who can integrate multiple vendor solutions. We're seeing increasing amount of enterprises with multi-cloud environments, and I think those specialists, especially in telephony, who can assist with configuration, installation, and management of integrated communication solutions, including contact center and the networking solutions that Finbar was talking about, will be able to drive the most value. And finally, considering the business model is going to be key. Are you set up to partner with Microsoft using their model, or would you be better to explore alternative options? I think service providers need to really examine all the possibilities in detail to make sure they make the right choice. That's it from me on Microsoft. We've got loads more detail on this. As I said, I've got the breakdowns for the individual countries if anyone's interested in that, and we've got loads of other research on Microsoft. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, please do get in touch with me or the wider team. But for now, thanks for joining me for the session.